The shock did not arrive with sirens. It came quietly, sealed inside ordinary garden planters, hidden beneath soil meant to grow flowers. What investigators uncovered in Toronto would force a city to confront a terrifying truth. For years, a killer had been moving freely through familiar streets, shaking hands, smiling, blending in. The question that still haunts this case is chillingly simple. How could someone capable of such violence remain unseen for so long? Before the headlines, before the charges, before the names of the dead were spoken aloud in courtrooms and memorials, there were lives being lived. Men with friends, routines, ambitions, and histories. Some were recent immigrants chasing stability. Some were artist caretakers, or sons calling home. They gathered in Toronto's church, Wellesley Village, a neighborhood known for safety, pride, and community. For many, it was a refuge. No one imagined it would also become a hunting ground. They vanished quietly, one by one. At first, their disappearances were treated as isolated, adults starting new lives, leaving without explanation. But absences wait. Friends noticed unanswered messages. Family members felt something was wrong. Candles appeared. Posters faded on telephone poles. Still, time passed and the city moved on. And all the while, Bruce McArthur was still there. To his neighbors, McArthur was unremarkable, a soft-spoken older man, a self-employed landscaper with dirt under his fingernails and work boots by the door. He decorated Christmas trees in malls as Santa Claus, posed for photos with children, and chatted politely with parents. He knew the neighborhood intimately, not just its streets, but its people. He socialized in the village. He worked in homes. He was trusted. There was nothing outwardly monstrous about him. But behind that ordinariness was a life built on access and control. McArthur's work gave him entry into private spaces. His age and demeanor disarmed suspicion. He knew who was vulnerable, who might not be immediately missed, whose disappearance might be explained away. The men who crossed his path often believed they were safe, meeting someone familiar, someone connected, someone who seemed to belong. What no one could see yet was that this normalcy was a disguise. Years later, when police would finally step into his apartment, they would find evidence so disturbing it would rewrite everything the city thought it knew about the missing. What had happened behind closed doors was not impulsive or chaotic. It was deliberate, methodical, and deeply violent. Bruce McArthur was not a stranger lurking in shadows. He was a man invited inside. And by the time the truth surfaced, 8 men were already gone. Disappearance is a special kind of cruelty. There is no final moment to grieve, no body to bury, no certainty to anchor the fear. For the families and friends of the men who vanished from Toronto's church, Wellesley Village, time stretched painfully. Days turned to years, hope eroding but never fully gone. Skandaraj Navratnam was one of the first. He had struggled, yes, but he was trying to rebuild. He had people who cared about him. When he stopped showing up, those who knew him sensed something was wrong, but his disappearance was quietly filed away. Another troubled man lost in a big city. Then came Abdulbasir Faizi, a refugee who had fled Afghanistan seeking safety. He was learning English, working hard, called his family back home. When he vanished, there was confusion, then silence. His loved ones were left suspended between fear and denial, clinging to belief that he had simply moved on. Majid Kayhan was known for his kindness and deep sense of responsibility to his family. He was dependable. When he didn't return calls, when days passed without contact, alarm bells rang, but answers did not come. Sarush Mahmoodi, a gentle soul, had been building a life in Canada after escaping violence in Iran. He spoke often of hope, of stability. Then he was gone, leaving behind a void filled with unanswered questions. Karashna Kumar Kanagaratnam was quiet and private, but he had a routine, places he went, people who recognized him. When he disappeared, those familiar rhythms abruptly stopped. No explanation followed. Years passed. Candles burned. Posters faded. Leads dried up. Then came Dean Lisowit, known in the village, outgoing and social. His disappearance shook the community more visibly. People began to whisper, "This feels wrong." Patterns were forming, even if authorities hesitated to name them. Salim Eason vanished next, a man who checked in with family regularly, who did not simply disappear without reason. His absence cut deep, reopening old wounds for those already grieving. Finally, Andrew Kinsman disappeared in 2017. Andrew was deeply loved, an activist, a caretaker, a friend who showed up for others. When he didn't return messages, people noticed immediately. His disappearance refused to stay quiet. Friends pushed harder. Pressure mounted. The sense that something terrible was happening could no longer be ignored. What tied these men together was not recklessness or secrecy. It was vulnerability. Many were immigrants. Some faced housing insecurity. Some lived on the margins. All trusted the community they were part of. All were seen last in spaces that should have been safe. Behind the scenes, fear was spreading. Conversations shifted from concern to dread. People began counting. How many? How long? Why them? The village, once a sanctuary, felt exposed. And still, the man responsible walked freely among them. The truth that these disappearances were not coincidences, not choices, not accidents, was closing in. One final disappearance would push investigators to look harder, dig deeper, and uncover what had been buried in plain sight. The moment of discovery was coming, and when it arrived, it would shatter the city. The truth did not surface all at once. It crept up through suspicion, surveillance, and a growing sense that time had already stolen too much. After Andrew Kinsman vanished, investigators treated the case differently. This time, the pressure from friends and community members was relentless. Andrew was not someone who disappeared without warning. He had commitments. He checked in. He showed up. Police began quietly watching people in his orbit, tracing his final movements, combing through digital footprints and witness accounts. One name kept resurfacing: Bruce McArthur. On January 18th, 2018, police followed McArthur into his apartment. What they discovered inside shattered any remaining doubt they had. A man was found restrained, alive, but bound, immobilized, and terrified. This was no longer speculation. It was now happening. Officers moved quickly, arrested McArthur on the spot. In that instant, years of unanswered questions collapsed into a single horrifying certainty. But the apartment was only the beginning. As investigators searched further, they uncovered digital evidence, photographs, timestamps, metadata, that pointed to something far worse than a single crime scene. The trail led outward beyond the apartment, into the soil of Toronto itself. McArthur's landscaping jobs became a roadmap. Police began excavating large decorative planters at properties where McArthur had worked. These were not shallow digs. The soil was packed down, layered, intentionally disturbed and concealed. And then they found it. Human remains, buried where flowers once grew, hidden in spaces meant to beautify homes. One planter turned into several. Several turned into a grim pattern. Each discovery carried an unbearable weight. Every set of remains meant a family's worst fear was now confirmed. The men who had vanished were not living new lives. They had not walked away. They had been killed and carefully hidden. For the city, the revelation was nauseating. These crimes had not occurred in abandoned places or forgotten corners. They were concealed in backyards, beside patios, near places where people drank coffee and watched seasons change. Death had been planted deliberately into the fabric of ordinary life. The scale of it stunned even seasoned investigators. McArthur had not acted in panic. He had planned. He had transported bodies. He had chosen locations where discovery seemed unlikely. The effort required to hide what had done revealed something deeply unsettling. Not just violence, but control, patience, and a chilling confidence that he would never be stopped. As the arrests and searches became public, the city reeled. Shock turned to horror. Horror turned to fury. People asked how this had gone on for so long, how so many warning signs could have been missed, how a predator could operate so openly without consequence. For the families of the victims, the discovery brought a painful clarity. The waiting was over, but so was hope. And as investigators continued digging, both literally and figuratively, they began to understand that this case was not only about one man's crimes. It was about everything that had allowed him to keep going. As the evidence mounted, another question pressed in, one that cut just as deeply as the crimes themselves. How did this go on for so long? Bruce McArthur did not emerge from nowhere. Long before his arrest in 2018, his name had crossed police desks. Years earlier, he had been charged in connection with an assault involving a man found bound in a stairwell. That case never went to trial. The charges were dropped. Life resumed. McArthur returned to the same neighborhood, the same social spaces, the same routines. When men began disappearing between 2010 and 2017, police initially treated each case as separate. Adults were presumed to have left voluntarily. Some were labeled transient. Others were assumed to have returned to their home countries. The possibility that a serial killer was operating in the heart of the city remained unspoken, even as community members grew increasingly alarmed. Behind the scenes, investigators did sense patterns, but uncertainty and hesitation slowed momentum. In 2012, a task force later known as Project Houston was formed to examine the disappearances of several men from the gay village. It produced theories, suspects, and internal debate, but no arrests. When leads dried up, the task force was quietly shut down. For the families, this felt like abandonment. Years later, when Andrew Kinsman disappeared, the pressure became impossible to ignore. His case launched Project Prism, a new investigative effort that finally re-examined older disappearances through a wider lens. This time, the approach was different. Surveillance was expanded, data was compared, patterns were revisited without assumptions. And when those older cases were laid side by side, the similarities were impossible to dismiss. The same neighborhood, the same types of victims, the same periods of disappearance, the same name lingering at the edges. What followed McArthur's arrest was not relief, it was reckoning. An independent civilian review was ordered to examine how police had handled the missing persons cases. Its findings were damning. Investigators acknowledged that unconscious bias may have influenced decisions, that assumptions about marginalized men, particularly immigrants, racialized individuals, and members of the LGBTQ+ community, had shaped how urgently their disappearances were pursued. The review concluded that opportunities to stop McArthur earlier had likely been missed. For the community, this realization was devastating. Trust in law enforcement cracked. Vigils turned into protests. Grief mixed with anger as families demanded accountability, not just for what McArthur had done, but for what institutions had failed to do. These crimes were not only acts of individual violence. They were also the result of silence, hesitation, and disbelief. And as the case moved toward court, the focus shifted once more from investigation to judgment. The city would soon hear, in stark detail, exactly what McArthur had done and how calculated his actions truly were. The most disturbing truths had yet to be spoken aloud. By the time the case reached the courtroom, the weight of what had been uncovered was already crushing. Evidence stacked high, digital files, forensic findings, timelines that no longer left room for doubt. Investigators were prepared for a long, agonizing trial, one that would force families to sit through every detail how their loved ones had been taken from them. Then, without warning, everything changed. On January 29, 2019, Bruce McArthur stood before the court and did something few expected. He pleaded guilty to 8 counts of first-degree murder. There was no dramatic speech, no public explanation, no expression of remorse that could soften what followed, just a flat acknowledgement that he was responsible for the deaths of 8 men. Men whose families had waited years to hear the truth spoken aloud. For some, the plea brought relief. The trial they feared would re-traumatize them would never happen. They would not be forced to listen to days of graphic testimony or see images they could never unsee. For others, the guilty plea felt like another theft, an ending without answers, a confession without explanation. At sentencing, the court laid out the facts with devastating clarity. McArthur had used restraints. He had photographed his victims. He had concealed their bodies with deliberate care. The acts were not spontaneous. They were controlled, repeated, and calculated. The Crown described a pattern of domination and dehumanization, one that stripped victims of dignity even after death. Family members spoke. Their words were heavy with grief and restrained fury. They talked about phone calls that would never come, birthdays that passed in silence, futures erased. They described the unique pain of knowing their loved ones had been missing for years, only to learn they had been dead all along. When the sentence was delivered, life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years, there was no sense of victory. Justice, in this case, felt incomplete. The law had done what it could, but nothing could return what had been taken. McArthur listened quietly. He did not interrupt. He did not explain why he chose these men, why he kept going, or what finally stopped him from stopping himself. The silence he maintained was almost as disturbing as the crimes themselves. With the legal chapter closed, the city was left to reckon with what remained. Unanswered questions, unresolved anger, and the haunting knowledge that this tragedy unfolded not in darkness, but in plain sight. The trial was over, but the consequences were only beginning. When the courtroom doors closed and Bruce McArthur was led away, Toronto did not feel safer. It felt hollowed out. The relief that a killer had been stopped was quickly overtaken by grief, anger, and a deep sense of betrayal. In the church, Wellesley Village, people walk familiar streets differently now. Bars, parks, and street corners that once represented freedom and belonging felt altered, charged with memory. Conversations returned again and again to the same painful realization. This had happened here, in a place people believed would protect them, for the families of the victims. The sentence was not an ending. It was the beginning of a new kind of mourning. Some had spent years oscillating between hope and despair, only to learn their loved ones had been gone long before answers arrived. The trauma was layered. First the disappearance, then the discovery, then the details revealed in court. Closure, if it existed at all, was incomplete and fragile. Within the LGBTQ+ community, the wounds cut even deeper. Many felt they had been warning authorities for years. They spoke of a pattern no one wanted to name, of fears dismissed as paranoia, of missing men quietly categorized as transient or unstable. The fact that many victims were immigrants or lived on the margins only sharpened the sense that their lives had not been treated with urgency. Public anger swelled. An independent civilian review would later confirm what many already believed, that systemic failures, unconscious bias, and hesitation played a role in allowing McArthur to continue. The review acknowledged missed opportunities, moments where connections could have been made sooner, where lives might have been saved. For some, this acknowledgement was validating. For others, it came far too late. There was also the trauma of survival. Men who had interacted with McArthur, socially, romantically, casually, were forced to re-examine memories they once thought harmless. Ordinary encounters took on a sinister weight. The realization that chance alone may have separated them from becoming another victim left scars that were invisible but lasting. Vigils were held. Names were read aloud. Photos of the victims were displayed, not as case numbers, but as people. Friends shared stories of laughter, kindness, stubbornness, and love. In reclaiming their memories, the community pushed back against the way they had been reduced to headlines. Yet beneath the mourning was an unresolved tension. Trust had been broken. Trust in safety. Trust in institutions. Trust that someone would notice in time. The McArthur case forced Toronto to confront uncomfortable truths, not just about one man's capacity for violence, but about whose disappearances prompt action, whose fears are believed, and whose lives are quietly allowed to fade. And even as memorials stood and reforms were promised, one haunting question refused to go away. What other warnings are still being ignored? Even now, long after the sentencing, the Bruce McArthur case refuses to settle into history. It lingers, not as a closed chapter, but as an open wound. Memorials stand where fear once ruled. Names once spoken only in police briefings are now spoken with intention, with care. Skandaraj, Abdulbasir, Majid, Sarush, Kirushna, Dean, Salim, Andrew. They are remembered not for how they died, but for who they were: friends, sons, brothers, caretakers, dreamers. The community reclaimed them from the darkness that tried to erase them, and yet unanswered questions remain. McArthur never explained why. Why these men? Why the compulsion to dominate, restrain, photograph, and bury? Why he continued for years without stopping himself? Psychological experts have suggested patterns of control, sexual sadism, and compartmentalization, A man capable of living two lives without emotional leakage. He planned carefully. He selected victims he believed would not trigger immediate alarm. He exploited trust, vulnerability, and invisibility. What remains chilling is not just his violence, but his ability to return to normalcy afterward. Tending gardens, smiling for photos, blending back into the world as if nothing had happened. Could he have stopped? Were there moments he hesitated? Or was the absence of consequences itself a permission? The broader mystery is not confined to McArthur's mind. It lives in the system around him. How many warnings does it take before a pattern is taken seriously? How many disappearances must occur before urgency replaces doubt? And how many lives exist at the margins, quietly waiting to be believed? The case reshaped conversations about policing, bias, and accountability in Canada. It forced institutions to look inward and communities to demand better. But reforms on paper cannot erase the years that were lost, or the fear that something similar could happen again if vigilance fades. True crime often tempts us to search for monsters, as if identifying one will keep us safe. But this story offers a more unsettling truth. Sometimes the most dangerous figures are those who seem ordinary, who rely not on secrecy, but on our assumptions. Bruce McArthur is behind bars, but the questions he left behind are still free. What would you have noticed sooner? What warnings do you think were missed? And what responsibility do communities and institutions carry when people disappear quietly? Share your thoughts, reflections, or theories in the comments. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe and turn on notifications for more in-depth true crime narratives that center the victims, question the systems, and confront the darkest corners of human behavior. Because remembering is not just about the past. It's about what we refuse to overlook again.